Yesterday, Republican Congressman Mark Meadows brought a black woman who works in the Trump administration to stand silently beside him during the Michael Cohen hearing to prove Michael Cohen was wrong yesterday when he said Donald Trump is a racist. Freshman Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib had something to say about that.
Just because someone has a person of color, a black person working for them, does not mean they aren't racist. And it is insensitive that some would even say it's the fact that someone would actually use a prop, a black woman, in this chamber, in this committee, is alone racist in itself. Donald Trump is setting a precedent.
Mr. Chairman, I ask that her words be taken down.
And then the hearing went off the rails for the next few minutes as Chairman Elijah Cummings masterfully refereed the dispute that broke out between Congresswoman Tlaib and Mark Meadows, who claimed that Congresswoman Tlaib had called him a racist, which technically and only technically she didn't. She said what he did was racist. Mark Meadows knew that the rules of the House were on his side and asking for Congresswoman Tlaib's words to be taken down, stricken from the congressional record of that hearing. The rules of decorum of the House of Representatives do not allow members to make comments, quote, affecting the rights, reputation, and conduct of members, end quote. Have that one memorized. The only people in the world that members of the House of Representatives are not allowed to insult are members of the House of Representatives. The Constitution actually grants members of Congress the right to say anything about anyone, no matter how libelous it may be, as long as they say it on the House and Senate floor or in hearing rooms. They are completely immune from libel laws as long as they're in that building. Freshman members of Congress are warned about this. They're warned about the decorum rules. And so Congresswoman Tlaib knew yesterday that the rules of the House gave Mark Meadows the privilege of calling for a vote to remove her words from the record of the hearing. And so she diplomatically saved her chairman, Elijah Cummings, from having to call a vote of the committee on striking her words. She said she did not intend to call Mark Meadows a racist.
To my colleague, Mr. Meadows, that was not my intention, and I do apologize.
Then this morning, just before noon, Mark Meadows approached Congresswoman Tlaib on the floor of the House and asked to put the episode behind them, which she graciously agreed to do, and the moment even included this hug. The reason Mark Meadows desperately wanted to get this behind him is that by the time he approached Congresswoman Tlaib on the House floor this morning, two different videos emerged showing that Mark Meadows ran for Congress on sending President Barack Obama, his words, back home to Kenya.
What we're going to do is take back our country. 2012 is the time that we're going to send Mr. Obama home to Kenya or wherever it is. We're going to do it.
3 days later, Mark Meadows was asked by a North Carolina voter if he is elected to Congress, will he pursue a congressional investigation of whether President Obama, who the questioner called this guy, is a citizen of the United States. Here was Mark Meadows' answer.
Yes.
So there you see Mark Meadows running on the racist platform of send the black president back to Africa and lying to a voter who wants him to do that. Mark Meadows told his voters then, yes, he would pursue a congressional investigation of President Obama's birth certificate, and that was a lie. He never did that. And because Mark Meadows is a politician, he wasn't finished with that one-word answer to that question.
You know, I see it as if we do our job from a grassroots standpoint, we won't have to worry about it. You know what? We'll send him back home to Kenya or wherever it is. You know, we'll send him back home, and so in doing that, I believe that what we will find is that we will get a new commander-in-chief.
Mark Meadows grew up in the 1960s in Brandon, Florida. I grew up in the 1960s in Boston. It's hard to say which place was more racist then. Probably about the same. Here's my Boston in 1976. The man in the three-piece suit who survived that attack is Ted Landsmark, a distinguished Boston attorney. The guy with the flag is from a neighborhood just like mine. all white, and just about all racist in those days. I grew up with guys who wanted to do things like that. And no one who grew up in my neighborhood in Boston was surprised the day we saw that photograph on the front page of the Boston Globe. But Boston has changed a lot since then. We had some white racist politicians in Boston when I was growing up, and we had even more blatant white racist politicians in the South when Mark Meadows was growing up. A white racist governor who stood in the doorway in the University of Alabama trying to keep it a racist institution. But Governor George Wallace was crushed that day by President Kennedy's administration, who forced him out of that doorway. And just as we've seen in Boston, many white politicians in the South grew and changed and were eventually replaced by more enlightened politicians. But there are more modern-day inheritors of the kind of racism that Southern politicians confidently demonstrated when Mark Meadows was a kid. When I was growing up, it seemed like every other day it was send them back to Africa. Heard that every other day in my neighborhood. Not from a politician, just someone in my neighborhood speaking from a hardcore racist heart. Send them back to Africa is one of the oldest racist refrains in the history of American racism, and that is what Mark Meadows chose to echo when he decided to run for Congress. He used racism to get his job. That is racist. Send President Barack Obama back to Kenya. You don't get to use racist tools in your political campaign and then come close to tears in Congress when you think someone just called you a racist, which you most definitely are. Send President Barack Obama home to Kenya is a classic racist political play. And the only people who have to apologize for calling Mark Meadows a racist are the people he goes to work with every day in the House of Representatives because of the rules of decorum of the House of Representatives. But until Mark Meadows apologizes for running a racist campaign to get his job in Congress, then everyone outside of the House of Representatives has the right and the moral authority to call him a racist. Because if we pretend that the people who say and do racist things aren't racist, then we are denying the very existence of racism, and that is a grave crime against the truth of life in America and American history. If Mark Meadows isn't a racist, no one is. Even George Wallace eventually apologized for his racist tactics as governor of Alabama before he died. Tonight, America awaits Mark Meadows' apology. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.